The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as guard Thomas Mitchell took his position at the main gate. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, his black bearskin hat sat exactly straight, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. Thomas had been standing guard at the palace for 12 years, and in all that time he had never once broken protocol. Not even a twitch of his eye or the slightest curve of his lips had betrayed any emotion while on duty. Thomas came from a military family in Yorkshire. His father had served in the Royal Navy, his grandfather in the Army, and his great-grandfather had fought in 2 world wars. When Thomas was just 8 years old, his father had taken him to London to see the changing of the guard ceremony. The young boy had watched in awe as the guards marched in perfect formation, their faces like stone statues, completely unmoved by the crowds of tourists taking pictures and calling out to them. "Those men," his father had said, placing a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder, "represent the very best of British tradition. They protect our Queen and our country with honor and dignity. They never let anything distract them from their duty." From that moment, Thomas knew what he wanted to become. He spent his teenage years training, studying military history, and preparing himself for the rigorous selection process. When he finally earned his place among the Queen's Guard, his father had tears in his eyes. Thomas felt the weight of generations of service on his shoulders, and he wore it proudly. The tourists loved to test the guards. They would make funny faces, tell jokes, wave frantically, and sometimes even try to touch the guards or their uniforms. Children would dance in front of them. Adults would pose for selfies mere inches from their faces, and teenagers would attempt elaborate pranks. Through it all, Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his expression never changing. His fellow guards respected him for his unwavering discipline. Even during the longest shifts when their feet ached and the weather turned harsh, Thomas never wavered. During summer heat waves when tourists fainted from the heat, Thomas stood firm. During winter storms when the wind cut through their uniforms like knives, Thomas remained at his post without the slightest shiver. The other guards would sometimes joke that Thomas had ice water in his veins instead of blood. They called him the statue because he seemed more like carved stone than flesh and blood. Thomas didn't mind the nickname. In fact, he took pride in it. He saw his ability to remain completely motionless and expressionless as the highest form of professional achievement. Thomas lived alone in a small flat near the palace. His personal life was simple and orderly, just like his professional duties. He woke at the same time every day, followed the same morning routine, and arrived at work exactly 15 minutes early. He kept his uniform in perfect condition, polishing every button and buckle until they gleamed. His spare time was spent reading military history books and maintaining his physical fitness. He had few close friends, partly because his demanding schedule left little time for socializing, but mostly because he found it difficult to relate to people who didn't understand the importance of duty and tradition. His relationships with women never lasted long because they couldn't understand why he was so serious all the time, why he never seemed to truly relax or let his guard down. The palace staff knew Thomas well. He had been there longer than most of them, and they respected his dedication even if they found him a bit cold and distant. The other guards would chat and joke when they were off duty, but Thomas usually kept to himself, reviewing procedures or studying the latest security protocols. On this particular Tuesday morning in early spring, Thomas felt the familiar sense of purpose as he took his position. The palace was expecting several thousand visitors that day, as it was during the peak tourist season. School groups had already begun arriving, their excited chatter filling the air as teachers tried to keep them organized and quiet. Thomas had positioned himself at the main entrance gate, one of the most photographed spots in all of London. Throughout the morning, he had already posed unknowingly for hundreds of pictures. Tourists from around the world had snapped selfies. With him in the background, children had pointed and stared in wonder at his tall hat and red coat, and guides had explained to their groups about the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. As the morning progressed, the crowds grew larger and more energetic. A group of American tourists tried to get him to smile by telling jokes. A family from Japan attempted to engage him in conversation about the weather. A group of university Students from Germany tried to distract him by singing songs and dancing. Through it all, Thomas remained perfectly still, his face showing no emotion, his body as rigid as a statue. But something felt different about this day, though Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the unusually warm spring air, or the way the sunlight seemed to dance across the palace walls. Or maybe it was simply that he had been doing this job for so long that he was beginning to feel the weight of all those years of rigid self-control. As the clock approached noon, the crowds reached their peak. Families with children pressed against the palace gates, everyone eager to get the perfect photograph or to witness something special. The noise level had risen considerably, with multiple languages being spoken simultaneously as tour guides explained the significance of what visitors were seeing. Thomas had learned to tune out most of the noise and commotion around him. It had become like background music that he barely noticed anymore. But today, something was about to happen that would test every ounce of his legendary self-control and challenge everything he believed about duty, tradition, and the importance of never showing emotion while on guard duty. Something small and innocent was approaching that would change not only his day, but his entire perspective on what it truly meant to serve with honor. Among the crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace that Tuesday morning was a family from a small village in Scotland. Margaret and James Henderson had saved for 2 years to bring their 6-year-old daughter, Lucy, to London for her birthday. It was Lucy's first time visiting the capital city, and her eyes were wide with wonder at everything she saw. Lucy was a special child in many ways. Born with a mild form of autism, she experienced the world differently than other children her age. While some situations overwhelmed her, she had an extraordinary ability to notice details that others missed, and a pure, innocent way of connecting with people that was both rare and beautiful. Her parents had worried about how she would handle the busy crowds and noise of London, but Lucy seemed to be thriving in the excitement. The little girl had been fascinated by the stories her grandfather told her about the Queen's Guards. He had served in the military himself many years ago, and had filled Lucy's imagination with tales of brave soldiers who protected the Queen and stood as still as statues no matter what happened around them. Lucy had spent weeks before the trip practicing standing perfectly still in her bedroom, trying to be like the guards she would soon see. She wore her favorite blue dress with white flowers, the one her grandmother had made especially for this trip. Her blonde curls were tied back with a blue ribbon that matched her dress, and she carried a small stuffed bear that went everywhere with her. Lucy's parents had explained to her about the guards and how they had to stay very serious and still while they were working. But Lucy didn't quite understand why someone would want to look sad all the time. As the family approached the palace gates, Lucy broke away from her parents and pressed her face against the iron bars, trying to get a better look at the guard standing nearby. Thomas stood just a few feet away, magnificent in his red tunic and tall black hat, his rifle held at the perfect angle, his eyes staring straight ahead at some invisible point in the distance. Lucy studied him carefully for several minutes, tilting her head from side to side as she tried to understand what she was seeing. She had expected the guards to look grand and important, which they certainly did, but she hadn't expected them to look so lonely. In her innocent way, she began to imagine what it would be like to stand so still for so long, unable to talk to anyone or even smile at the children who came to see you. Her mother, Margaret, called softly for Lucy to come back, worried that her daughter might accidentally do something that would get them in trouble. But Lucy was transfixed by the guard. She watched as tourists took pictures with him, as children pointed and stared, as adults made jokes trying to get him to react. Through it all, the guard never moved, never acknowledged anyone, never showed the slightest sign that he was even aware of the crowds around him. Lucy's young mind began working in the special way that made her different from other children. She didn't see a stern, unapproachable soldier following strict rules. Instead, she saw someone who looked like he might be sad or lonely, someone who had to stand by himself all day while people looked at him but never really saw him as a person. Her heart, which was always quick to feel compassion for others, went out to this man who seemed so isolated in the middle of all these people. She turned to her mother and tugged on her coat. "Mummy," she whispered, "why does the soldier man look so sad?" Margaret looked at the guard, trying to see what her daughter saw. To her, he looked professional and dignified, exactly as a Queen's Guard should look. "He's not sad, sweetheart. He's just doing his job. He has to stand very still and be very serious while he's working." But Lucy shook her head. She had a gift for reading people's emotions even when they were trying to hide them. Something about the guard's posture, or perhaps the way he held his shoulders, told her that underneath that perfect uniform was someone who carried a heavy burden. Lucy's father, James, had been taking pictures of the palace and the guards, but he noticed his daughter's intense focus on one particular guard. He knelt down beside her and followed her gaze. "What are you thinking about, little one?" "The soldier man needs someone to be nice to him," Lucy said simply. "Everyone just looks at him, but nobody says hello or asks if he's okay." James smiled at his daughter's innocent observation. He tried to explain that the guards weren't supposed to talk to people while they were working, that it was part of their job to ignore the crowds and focus on protecting the queen. But Lucy's mind was already working on a different level. She began to notice things that the adults around her missed. She saw how the guard's fingers gripped his rifle just a little too tightly, suggesting tension. She noticed that while his eyes stared straight ahead, there was a slight tightness around them that spoke of weariness. She observed how he stood perfectly straight, but there was something in his bearing that seemed to carry the weight of years of isolation and rigid self-control. Other children in the crowd were trying to get the guard's attention in typical ways. They made funny faces, waved their arms, called out questions, and even tried to touch his uniform. But Lucy instinctively understood that these approaches were all wrong. They were treating the guard like an attraction at a theme park rather than like a real person with real feelings. As she continued to watch, Lucy began to formulate a plan in her innocent mind. She didn't want to break any rules or get the guard in trouble, but she felt strongly that someone needed to show him a small act of kindness. She had learned from her grandmother that sometimes the smallest gestures could mean the most to someone who was having a difficult day. Lucy's parents were busy taking pictures and reading information about the palace from their guidebook, occasionally glancing over to make sure their daughter was staying close by. They had learned to trust Lucy's generally good judgment, and she seemed perfectly content watching the guard, so they allowed her to continue her quiet observation. The morning sun was growing warmer, and Lucy could see tiny beads of sweat beginning to form on the guard's forehead beneath his heavy hat. She imagined how hot and uncomfortable that thick red uniform must be, especially standing in the direct sunlight for hours without being able to move or even wipe your face. Her young heart was moved by compassion, and she began to think about what she could do to brighten this serious man's day. Even just a little bit. She looked around at what she had available, considering her options carefully in the methodical way that was characteristic of how her mind worked. Lucy spent the next few minutes carefully considering what she could do for the guard. She looked through her small backpack that her mother had packed with snacks and a few of her favorite things for the trip. She had some colorful stickers that she loved, a small bag of her favorite sweets, and of course, her beloved stuffed bear named Mr. Buttons. As she thought about it, Lucy remembered something her grandmother had taught her about showing kindness to others. "Sometimes, Lucy," her grandmother had said, "the most precious gift you can give someone is something that means a lot to you. When you share something special, it shows the person that they are important enough to deserve your very best." Lucy's eyes fell on a small daisy chain that she had made the day before while playing in the hotel garden. She had carefully picked the tiny white daisies and spent nearly an hour threading them together, with the intense focus that was characteristic of how she approached tasks she cared about. The little chain of flowers wasn't much to look at, but she had made it with her own hands and had been quite proud of her work. She held the daisy chain up to the sunlight, examining it thoughtfully. The flowers were still fresh and white, with their cheerful yellow centers bright against the green stems. To Lucy, it looked like a tiny crown fit for a fairy or perhaps a bracelet for someone special. Most adults would have seen it as nothing more than wilted weeds that a child had strung together. But to Lucy, it represented hours of careful work and the pure joy she felt when creating something beautiful. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this was exactly the right gift for the guard. It was something happy and colorful to brighten his serious uniform. It was something she had made with love and care. Most importantly, it was a gesture of friendship from one person to another, with no expectation of anything in return. Lucy's parents were still absorbed in their sightseeing, taking pictures of the palace architecture and reading about the history of the monarchy. They had learned to give their daughter some independence in safe situations like this, knowing that her thoughtful nature usually kept her out of trouble. They could see her standing quietly near the guard, and she seemed perfectly content, so they continued their exploration of the palace grounds. As Lucy watched the guard, she began to notice more details about him as a person, rather than just as a colorful figure in a uniform. She could see that he was quite tall, probably taller than her daddy. His hands looked strong but gentle, and despite his serious expression, there was something about his face that seemed kind. She imagined that when he wasn't working, he might have a nice smile and maybe even laugh at funny jokes. The crowds around them continued to grow as more tour groups arrived. Lucy watched as people from all over the world took pictures with the guard, but she noticed that none of them seemed to really see him as a real person. They treated him more like a statue or a tourist attraction. Children would pose next to him making silly faces for photos. Adults would make comments about his uniform or his height, and teenagers would dare each other to try to make him move or react. Through it all, the guard remained perfectly still and professional, but Lucy's special sensitivity to emotions allowed her to perceive something that others missed. She could sense a deep loneliness in his rigid posture, a weariness that came from years of being looked at but not truly seen, of being surrounded by people but never being able to connect with any of them. Lucy made her decision. She would give the guard her daisy chain, not as a silly attempt to break his concentration or make him react, but as a genuine gift from one human being to another. She understood instinctively that she couldn't expect him to respond or acknowledge her gift while he was working, but she felt certain that it would mean something to him to know that someone had noticed him as a person and wanted to brighten his day. The little girl began to move closer to the guard, walking slowly and purposefully. She wasn't trying to sneak up on him or startle him. Instead, she approached with the same careful respect she would show when approaching a sleeping cat or a bird that she didn't want to frighten away. As she got closer, Lucy could see even more details. She noticed that despite the guard's perfect posture, there were tiny signs of the physical strain of standing motionless for so long. She could see the slight tension in his jaw muscles, and the way his knuckles were just barely white from gripping his rifle. She realized that this job was much harder than it looked, requiring not just physical strength but enormous mental discipline. Lucy's heart filled with even more compassion as she understood better what this man was enduring for his duty. She thought about how difficult it must be to ignore all the people around him, especially the children who were trying so hard to get his attention. She imagined how he must feel having to pretend that hundreds of people weren't staring at him, photographing him, and talking about him as if he couldn't hear every word they said. Other children in the crowd had tried various ways to interact with the guard. Some had shouted questions at him, others had waved frantically, and a few had even tried to touch his uniform or weapon. But Lucy recognized that all of these approaches were somehow wrong. They were all focused on getting a reaction, on breaking the guard's concentration, on making him fail at his job in some small way. Lucy's approach would be different. She didn't want to distract him or make his job harder. She simply wanted to leave a small token of kindness that would let him know that someone had seen him not just as a guard, but as a person deserving of friendship and respect. With the daisy chain held carefully in her small hands, Lucy took the final steps toward the guard. She could now see the individual threads in his red uniform, the detailed craftsmanship of his buttons and badges, and the careful way his weapon was positioned. She was close enough to hear his steady breathing and to see the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. Lucy looked up at the guard's face one more time, seeing past the stern expression to the human being underneath. In her innocent wisdom, she understood that sometimes the greatest kindness is the kind that asks for nothing in return. Lucy stood directly in front of Thomas now, so close that she had to tilt her head far back to see his face beneath the tall black hat. From this angle, he seemed enormous to the small child, like a giant from one of her storybooks. But instead of feeling frightened or intimidated, Lucy felt a gentle calmness. Something about his presence, despite his rigid posture and serious expression, made her feel safe. She held the daisy chain carefully in both hands, studying it one last time before her gift-giving moment. The little white flowers seemed even more delicate and beautiful when held against the backdrop of the guard's bright red uniform. Lucy had always loved the way daisies looked so cheerful and innocent, like tiny suns scattered across a green field. Thomas, of course, was completely aware of the little girl's presence. His training had taught him to be conscious of everything happening around him, even while maintaining his stoic pose. He had noticed her approaching slowly and respectfully, unlike the many children who had run up to him throughout the morning making noise and trying to get his attention. Through his peripheral vision, Thomas could see that this child was different. She wasn't jumping around or making faces or calling out to him. Instead, she seemed to be studying him with a quiet intensity that was unusual for someone so young. He had learned to read people quickly during his years of guard duty, and something about this little girl's energy felt peaceful rather than disruptive. Lucy took a deep breath and stepped forward until she was standing right next to Thomas's polished black boots. She was so small that the top of her head barely reached his waist. For a moment, she simply stood there, gathering her courage and deciding exactly how to carry out her mission of kindness. Then, with the careful precision that characterized everything she did, Lucy gently placed the daisy chain around the toe of Thomas's right boot. She arranged it carefully so that the flowers lay flat against the shiny black leather, creating a small circle of white and yellow brightness against the dark surface. The action took only a few seconds, but in those moments something extraordinary happened. Thomas felt his carefully constructed wall of professional detachment begin to crack just slightly. For 12 years, he had perfected the art of ignoring every attempt by tourists to get his attention or break his concentration. He had withstood jokes, songs, loud noises, and even physical attempts to distract him. But this gentle, respectful gesture from a small child was somehow different. Lucy stepped back and looked up at Thomas's face. She didn't expect him to respond or acknowledge her gift while he was working. Somehow she understood that he wasn't allowed to do that. But she wanted to see his face one more time, to look into his eyes and silently communicate that her gift came from a place of pure kindness. What happened next would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. As Lucy's bright blue eyes met Thomas's steady gaze, something passed between them that transcended words or rules or military protocol. For just a fraction of a second, Thomas saw past the crowd of tourists and the pressure of his duties and simply connected with another human being who had shown him unexpected kindness. The corner of Thomas's mouth began to twitch almost imperceptibly. He fought against it with all the discipline he had developed over 12 years of guard duty. His training screamed at him to maintain his expression, to ignore the gesture, to remain the perfect statue that his position demanded. But something stronger was working against his iron self-control. Lucy continued to look up at him with her innocent, hopeful expression. She wasn't trying to make him break character or get him in trouble. Her eyes simply radiated the pure joy of someone who had just done something kind for another person. There was no mischief in her gaze, no attempt to trick him or catch him in a moment of weakness. There was only genuine warmth and friendship. The internal battle Thomas was fighting was visible to those who knew what to look for. His jaw muscles tightened as he tried to maintain his neutral expression. His grip on his rifle became even more precise as he focused on his training. But the daisy chain around his boot seemed to be working some kind of magic that he couldn't quite resist. Other people in the crowd began to notice what was happening. Some parents pulled out their phones, sensing that they might be about to witness something unusual. A few other guards in the distance began to pay closer attention, though they remained at their own posts. Even some of the palace staff who were walking by slowed their pace, curious about the interaction between the tiny girl and the towering guard. Lucy's parents, Margaret and James, finally noticed where their daughter had gone. They looked over to see her standing right next to the guard with something at his feet. Margaret started to move toward them, worried that Lucy might be doing something inappropriate, but James caught her arm and pointed to their daughter's peaceful posture. "Look at her," he whispered. "She's not being disruptive. She's just being Lucy." They watched as their special little girl stood quietly beside the guard, not demanding attention or trying to force a reaction, but simply sharing a moment of genuine human connection. They could see that whatever she had done it with the same thoughtful consideration that she brought to everything in her life. The crowd around them began to grow quieter as more people noticed the unusual scene. Word seemed to spread silently through the tourists that something significant was happening, though many of them couldn't quite understand what it was. Children stopped their shouting and pointing. Adults lowered their voices. Even the most boisterous teenagers seemed to sense that they were witnessing something that deserved respect. Thomas could feel the weight of all those eyes on him, and it only made his internal struggle more intense. Every instinct trained into him over 12 years demanded that he remain unmoved, unchanged, unaffected by the actions of the people around him. But the pure innocence of Lucy's gesture was like nothing he had ever experienced during his time on guard duty. The little daisy chain around his boot felt like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. It was just a few wilted flowers strung together by a child, worth nothing in monetary terms and likely to be discarded as soon as his shift ended. But somehow it represented something much larger, a reminder that beneath his uniform and his rigid training, he was still a human being capable of feeling touched by unexpected kindness. Lucy smiled up at him one more time, a gentle, knowing smile that seemed to say she understood exactly what was happening, and that it was perfectly okay whatever he decided to do. Then she took a small step back, giving him space while still staying close enough that he could see her encouraging expression. The moment stretched on like an eternity, though in reality it lasted only seconds. Thomas stood frozen, not by his training this time, but by the unexpected emotion welling up inside him. For 12 years, he had perfected the art of shutting down any human feelings while on duty. He had convinced himself that emotions were a weakness, a distraction from the serious business of protecting the crown and upholding centuries of military tradition. But Lucy's simple gift had somehow pierced through all of his carefully constructed defenses. The daisy chain around his boot wasn't just a child's innocent gesture. It was a reminder of everything he had given up in pursuit of perfect discipline. It made him think of his own childhood, of the simple joys he had set aside when he chose this path of rigid self-control. Thomas remembered being Lucy's age, running through the Yorkshire fields near his family's home, picking wildflowers for his mother and laughing at the silly games his sister invented. When had he stopped allowing himself those moments of pure, uncomplicated happiness? When had he decided that showing emotion was somehow incompatible with honor and duty? The crowd around them had grown completely silent now, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something remarkable. Phones were held ready to capture the moment, but even the most eager photographers seemed to sense that this was too sacred to interrupt with the click of camera shutters. Lucy continued to stand patiently, her small hands clasped in front of her blue dress, her blonde curls catching the sunlight. There was no impatience in her posture, no demand for recognition or response. She had given her gift freely, with no expectation of anything in return. Her eyes remained fixed on Thomas's face with the kind of trust and openness that only children possess. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The weight of all those years of isolation, of standing alone while thousands of people looked through him rather than at him, suddenly felt almost unbearable. Lucy was the first person in his 12 years of guard duty who had seen him not as a tourist attraction or a symbol of tradition, but simply as a human being who might need a moment of kindness. The battle between his training and his humanity was reaching its peak. His commanding officers had drilled into him that any display of emotion while on duty was a failure of the highest order. Breaking character even slightly could result in disciplinary action, possibly even the end of his career. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, could be lost in a single moment of weakness. But looking down at Lucy's innocent face, Thomas began to question whether showing basic human warmth was really weakness at all. This little girl had approached him with respect and gentleness, not trying to make him fail at his job, but simply trying to brighten his day. Was it really so wrong to acknowledge that kindness even in the smallest way? The daisy chain around his boot seemed to pulse with symbolic meaning. Each small flower represented something beautiful and fleeting in a world that often felt too serious and cold. The green stems that held them together spoke of growth and life and the connections that bind all living things. Even the fact that the flowers would soon wilt and fade only made their present beauty more precious. Thomas thought about his father, who had first brought him to see the guards all those years ago. Would his father really want him to ignore such a pure gesture of human kindness? His father had taught him about honor and duty, but he had also taught him about compassion and the importance of recognizing goodness in others. He thought about his fellow guards, some of whom had become like brothers to him over the years. Would they really think less of him for showing a moment of human warmth to a child who had shown him such respect? Or would they understand that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from rigid control, but from the courage to be genuinely human? The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and the gentle whisper of wind through the palace grounds. Lucy never took her eyes off Thomas's face, but her expression remained patient and understanding. She seemed to know that something important was happening inside him, and she was willing to wait as long as it took. Thomas could feel his resolve weakening, and for the first time in his career he wasn't entirely sure that was a bad thing. The strict rules and protocols that had governed his life for so long suddenly seemed less important than this moment of genuine human connection. Lucy had reminded him that beneath his uniform and his responsibilities, he was still a person capable of feeling gratitude and warmth. The corner of his mouth began to twitch again, more noticeably this time. He tried once more to force his expression back to neutral, but the effort felt hollow and artificial. How could he maintain his stone-faced composure when faced with such innocent generosity? How could he pretend that Lucy's gesture meant nothing when it had touched something deep in his heart that he had thought was permanently locked away? The crowd seemed to sense that the moment of decision was approaching. Some people held their breath. Others leaned forward slightly, and a few parents pulled their own children closer to make sure they wouldn't miss whatever was about to happen. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that didn't happen every day. Perhaps something that had never happened before in the long history of the Queen's Guard. Lucy took one small step closer to Thomas, not to put pressure on him, but simply to let him know that she was still there, still believing in the goodness she saw in him. Her blue eyes sparkled with encouragement, and her gentle smile seemed to say that whatever happened next would be perfectly okay with her. Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside him. For 12 years he had believed that his job required him to deny his humanity while on duty. But Lucy had shown him that acknowledging kindness and responding with warmth might actually be the most human thing he could do. Maybe true honor wasn't about being a perfect statue, but about being a perfect human being, one who could maintain discipline and duty while still recognizing the beauty in unexpected moments of connection. And then it happened. After 12 years of perfect Stoic discipline, after thousands of hours of standing motionless while tourists tried every conceivable way to break his concentration, Thomas Mitchell smiled. It started as just the smallest curve at the corner of his mouth, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. But as he looked down at Lucy's hopeful face and the cheerful daisy chain around his boot, the smile grew wider and more genuine. It transformed his entire face, changing him from a stern, unapproachable figure into someone warm and human and wonderfully alive. The effect on the crowd was immediate and electric. A collective gasp went up from the hundreds of people who had gathered to witness this unprecedented moment. Cameras clicked frantically as everyone tried to capture the historic scene. Children pointed in excitement. Adults wiped tears from their eyes, and even the most jaded tourists found themselves moved by what they had just witnessed. But Thomas only had eyes for Lucy. As his smile reached its full brightness, he did something even more extraordinary. Moving slowly and carefully, he shifted his rifle to his left hand and reached down with his right to gently touch the brim of his tall black hat in a small salute, a gesture of respect and gratitude that spoke volumes without requiring any words. Lucy's face lit up with pure joy. She had not expected any response at all, knowing somehow that the guard wasn't supposed to react to the people around him. But his smile and small salute told her that her gift had been received in exactly the spirit she had intended. She had wanted to brighten his day, and the happiness now radiating from his face showed her that she had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes. The little girl responded with a curtsy that her grandmother had taught her, bending her knees slightly and holding the sides of her blue dress. It was a gesture of respect and friendship that seemed perfect for the moment. Then she stepped back and rejoined her parents, who were watching the scene with tears in their eyes and wonder in their hearts. Margaret and James Henderson knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Their special daughter, with her unique way of seeing the world and connecting with others, had accomplished something that no one else had managed to do in over a decade. She had reminded a man whose job required him to seem inhuman that the greatest honor sometimes comes from showing the full depth of our humanity. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that echoed off the palace walls. People were cheering not just for Thomas's smile, but for Lucy's kindness, for the beautiful reminder that even in our most formal and rigid institutions, there is always room for human warmth and connection. Thomas felt the weight of all those eyes on him, but for the first time in his career it didn't feel like pressure. Instead, it felt like celebration. He had broken the most fundamental rule of his profession, and yet somehow it felt like the most right thing he had ever done while on duty. The applause washing over him wasn't mocking or triumphant at his failure. It was joyful appreciation for a moment of genuine human beauty. Other guards stationed around the palace had noticed the commotion and were watching from their posts. Instead of disapproval, Thomas saw something surprising in their faces: respect, and perhaps even a touch of envy. How many of them had stood for hours and days and years, longing for just one moment of real human connection while on duty? How many had felt the same isolation that Thomas had carried for so long? As the applause began to die down, Thomas carefully moved his rifle back to its proper position and resumed his formal stance. But his face retained a gentle warmth that hadn't been there before Lucy's visit. The daisy chain remained around his boot, a visible reminder that sometimes the most important rules are the unwritten ones about treating each other with kindness and respect. Word of what had happened began to spread through the crowd with remarkable speed. People were already posting videos and photos on social media, sharing the story of the little girl who had made a Queen's Guard smile. Within minutes, the hashtag Daisy Chain Smile was trending, and the story was being shared around the world. Lucy's parents realized that their daughter had done something that would likely be remembered and talked about for years to come. But Lucy herself seemed completely unaware of the broader significance of what had happened. To her, she had simply seen someone who looked like he needed a friend, and she had acted on that instinct with the pure heart that made her so special. As the family prepared to continue their tour of London, Lucy looked back at Thomas one more time. He caught her eye, and while maintaining his formal posture, gave her the smallest nod of acknowledgement and gratitude. It was a moment between friends, a silent understanding that would connect them forever even though they might never see each other again. The daisy chain around Thomas's boot began to wilt slightly in the warm afternoon sun, but its symbolic power only grew stronger. Other children in the crowd, inspired by Lucy's example, began approaching the various guards with their own small gifts, drawings, flowers, even simple smiles offered with genuine respect and kindness. The other guards found themselves facing the same choice that Thomas had confronted. Some maintained their traditional Stoic expressions, but others allowed themselves small smiles or tiny nods of acknowledgement. It was as if Lucy's simple act of kindness had given them permission to remember their own humanity while still maintaining their professional dignity. By the end of that Tuesday afternoon, something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the Queen's Guards and the public they served. The rigid wall of separation had developed small cracks that allowed warmth to pass through. It didn't make the guards any less professional or dedicated to their duty. If anything, it made them more effective by reminding them that they were protecting real people, including innocent children who saw them as heroes worthy of friendship and respect. Palace officials, when they learned of the incident, found themselves in an unusual position. Technically, Thomas had violated protocol by reacting to a member of the public while on duty, but the overwhelmingly positive response from both the public and the international media made it clear that this was not a failure to be punished, but rather a beautiful reminder of the values that the monarchy and its guardians were meant to represent. As the day ended and Thomas's shift concluded, he carefully removed the daisy chain from his boot, but instead of discarding it, he placed it gently in his jacket pocket. It would find a place of honor in his small flat, a reminder that the greatest moments of his career might not be the ones that followed protocol perfectly, but the ones that honored the deeper protocols of human decency and connection. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood at the same gate of Buckingham Palace, but he was a changed man. The incident with Lucy had not only transformed his own perspective on his duties, but had also sparked a quiet revolution in how the Queen's Guards approached their public interactions. The story of the little girl and the daisy chain had traveled around the world. News outlets had picked up the video that tourists had captured, and it had been viewed millions of times online. People from every continent had been moved by the simple beauty of Lucy's gesture and Thomas's response. The image of the stern guard, with the tiny circle of flowers around his boot, had become a symbol of hope and human connection in a world that often felt divided and cold. Thomas had not been disciplined for his break in protocol, Instead, palace officials had quietly acknowledged that his response had actually enhanced the reputation of the Queen's Guard and the monarchy itself. The public's overwhelming positive reaction had shown that people didn't want their guardians to be emotionless machines, but rather honorable human beings who could maintain their dignity and duty while still acknowledging acts of genuine kindness. The other guards had noticed the change in how the public treated them since that Tuesday afternoon. Children approached them with more respect and less mischief. Adults seemed to see them as real people rather than tourist attractions. The quality of interactions had improved dramatically, creating a more positive atmosphere for everyone involved. Thomas himself had discovered that allowing moments of human warmth actually made him better at his job, not worse. He remained just as disciplined and professional as before, but now he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing he could be both dutiful and human. The rigid tension that had characterized his earlier years of service had been replaced by a more natural strength. On this particular morning, Thomas noticed a familiar family approaching the palace gates. His heart lifted as he recognized Margaret and James Henderson, walking hand in hand with Lucy, who had grown several inches and was now 7 years old. They had returned to London for another visit, and word had somehow reached them about which post Thomas would be working that day. Lucy looked older and more confident, but she still had the same gentle spirit and perceptive eyes that had seen past his uniform to the person underneath all those months ago. She was wearing a yellow dress this time, bright as sunshine, and carrying a small bouquet of fresh daisies that she had obviously chosen with great care. As the family approached, Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest. He maintained his professional posture, but his eyes followed Lucy's progress through the crowd with obvious affection. Other tourists, many of whom recognized the location from the viral video, began to gather around, sensing that something special might be about to happen. Lucy walked up to Thomas with the same respectful patience she had shown during their first encounter. She stood in front of him for a moment, looking up at his face with a smile that seemed to say she was happy to see her friend again. Then, with the same careful precision that had characterized her first gift, she gently placed the fresh bouquet of daisies at the base of the palace gate, close enough to Thomas's position that he could see and smell their sweet fragrance. This time, Thomas didn't hesitate. His smile came immediately, warm and genuine and filled with gratitude for this child who had taught him such an important lesson about the balance between duty and humanity. He gave her another small salute, and Lucy responded with another perfect curtsy, giggling softly at their shared secret language of respect and friendship. The crowd around them erupted in applause once again, but it was gentler this time, more reverent. Many of the spectators were people who had seen the original video and had come to this spot hoping to witness something similar. They understood that they were seeing not just a repeat performance, but the continuation of a beautiful friendship that had touched hearts around the world. Lucy's parents watched with tears in their eyes, proud of their daughter's capacity for kindness, and grateful for the way this friendship had shown the world something beautiful about human nature. They had received messages from people in dozens of countries, all sharing stories of how Lucy's simple gesture had inspired them to perform their own acts of unexpected kindness. As the family prepared to leave, Lucy approached Thomas one more time. She reached into her small purse and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. Without trying to disturb his formal stance, she gently tucked it into a small crevice in the stone wall beside his post, making sure it was secure but not intrusive. After they left, Thomas would discover that the paper contained a drawing Lucy had made of the two of them on that first special day. She had drawn herself as a tiny stick figure in a blue dress, standing next to a much taller figure in a red coat with a circle of flowers around his feet. At the top of the page, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for being my friend." The story of Lucy and Thomas became part of the folklore surrounding Buckingham Palace. Tour guides would tell visitors about the day a little girl's kindness had reminded everyone that the greatest traditions are not the ones that make us less human, but the ones that help us become more fully human, while serving something greater than ourselves. Thomas continued his service as a Queen's Guard for many more years, eventually rising to a position of leadership where he could help train new recruits. He always told them Lucy's story, emphasizing that true strength comes not from shutting down our humanity, but from learning when and how to express it appropriately. while maintaining our professional responsibilities. The original daisy chain, now dried and carefully preserved, held a place of honor in Thomas's home. But more importantly, the lesson Lucy had taught him lived on in every interaction he had with the public. In every moment when he chose connection over isolation, warmth over coldness, humanity over rigid protocol. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the most important moment of his career, he never spoke of ceremonies or dignitaries or moments of danger he had helped prevent. Instead, he would smile and tell them about a little girl in a blue dress who had reminded him that the greatest honor comes not from being perfect, but from being perfectly human in service to others. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the crowds were smaller and the pace was more peaceful, Thomas would look down at his polished boots and remember the weight of a tiny circle of flowers, and how something so small had changed everything about how he understood duty, honor, and the endless capacity of the human heart to surprise us with its goodness.